Well, a warm welcome to everybody, wherever you are viewing this webinar. Tim Baker's my name, and I'm going to lead you through this webinar today, which is about creating a culture of conversation in a changing workplace. Obviously, you're here because that's of interest to you, and perhaps you're looking at it from your own point of view, your own organisation. Perhaps the topic is of interest to you generally, or you might be a consultant who is perhaps looking at improving their practice. I first of all want to make an apology that I wasn't able to conduct this webinar at the original time, so I appreciate the fact that you were flexible. I was overseas and unfortunately wasn't able to deliver this webinar, but nevertheless, thank you for your attendance, and I hope you get something really useful out of the session that we're going to spend today. Now, as usual with these processes, I'd like you to, over on the right-hand side, there's a question panel there. And if you've got a question anytime during the webinar, then please write it in that box there so that at the end of the presentation, what I'll do is I'll have a Q&A. So if you put that question in there when you think about it, it's going to make things a lot easier at the end when I've got questions to answer from throughout the presentation. So anyway, let's get underway. So first of all, let me tell you a little story before I give you the details of what we're covering. This story I'm sure you'll relate to. It's a true story. It's one that happened several weeks ago, and it occurred in an engineering firm. There were two engineers working together on a multidisciplinary project. In fact, there were 25 in the project. And these two engineers were working in an open office plan. So they were basically sitting opposite each other, and the only thing that separated them was a partition. So in actual fact, if you took out the partition, they would probably only be sitting, a couple of meters away from each other. And both of them were involved in the project, but one of those engineers was particularly upset with the other engineer. In fact, he thought that his colleague was being very sloppy with some professional work, that he was just entirely unsatisfied with the way this engineer was conducting his part of the project. So he decided, and I think you probably know where this is going, he decided to tap out an email. And he tapped out an email expressing his dissatisfaction with his colleague. Several paragraphs, all the detail, all the heated words, all the emotion. And just before he's about to click the send button, he decided to copy in the other 23 people in the project. So basically 25 people in the project were going to get this email, including the two people involved. So he clicked the send button. And of course, the person who received it, which was only separated by a partition, got the email, and you can imagine that didn't go particularly well. Now, it's sort of humorous in one way, but it's also pretty tragic in another. That obviously what that engineer could have done, which would have been far more effective, would have been to get out of his chair and walk around the corner of his desk and ask to have a conversation with the other engineer, and obviously he could have expressed his concerns. But of course he didn't do that. He decided to do what I think a lot of people in the world of work do now, is they fall back on technology, when in actual fact a conversation would have been a far better way to deal with things. So I'm sure all of you have got your own stories around that, and I want to say right from the outset, I'm not anti-technology. I'm certainly very pro-technology. Obviously, we're using technology today. And I think what we're doing, though, is we're overusing technology, when in actual fact, often we can have a conversation with somebody which is going to bear far better fruit than it would be to send an email, such as my engineering colleague. So I just set the scene because I believe that sort of behaviour is going on in most organisations around the world, and I'm trying to change that. And I think what the book that I've written that's just been released, Conversations at Work, is attempting to do is to give people some awareness about how they can change their culture to become far more conversational. So what are we covering today? Okay, I have to say to you that you can try all the techniques in the world. You can provide people with all sorts of training and all sorts of things, but at the end of the day, if there was one barrier to a culture of conversations, it's having the right culture. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about that. You've got to get the culture right. If the culture's not right, for example, if it's a very hierarchical organisation where there's very limited trust, then having conversations is not going to occur, no matter how hard you try. I'm going to actually talk about 9 barriers. So if you think about the right culture as one barrier, I'm actually going to talk about 9 other barriers. Some of these barriers are emotional barriers, some are psychological barriers, and some are actually physical barriers. So I'm going to actually talk about those. Some of them you'll be able to do something about and others you won't. But at the end of the day, if you have all 9 barriers, then you've got some issues around creating a culture of conversation. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about a framework which some of you would be familiar with, which is the 5 Conversations framework, which is a framework for cultivating a culture of developmental conversations. There are some organisations, in fact there's quite a few organisations around the world that I'm working with right now, who've decided to throw out their performance review and go for the 5 Conversations framework. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. We have a model in the book, Aubrey, Warren and myself, both of us are authors of the book. We have a model in the book which we call the face of good communication. It's just a very simple way of talking about some of the micro skills that people need when they're having conversations with their colleagues. And I won't go into great detail with that today, other than to perhaps give you a couple of tips that come from the book, because we've got limited time, of course. We are going to talk about issues around perceptual positions, that is how people view or what the perspective they have when they go into a conversation is absolutely critical. And it's one of the hardest things to do, but one of the most important things to do. So that's one of the micro skills I'm going to talk about. I'm actually going to talk about 5 additional conversations as well that I think you should be encouraging in your organisation. And finally, I'm going to talk about the value and importance of questions in relation to conversations. Good conversationalists tend to ask a lot of questions, and if you ask a lot of questions, you're likely to have a good conversation. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation, and then I'll take some questions from you. So that's pretty much what we're covering, which is pretty much a broad brush of what's in Conversations at Work, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Okay, a couple of key things that I want to say about conversations, just to set the scene, that I think are quite important. The first thing I want to say about conversations, one of the catch cries in our book is that organisations are conversations. Now that might sound a bit simplistic, but if you actually think about it, all an organisation of people really is a series of conversations that are going on a regular basis. There are hundreds, thousands, if not tens of thousands of conversations going on in every organisation every day. Some of them are done at the water cooler, some of them are done in the toilet, some of them are done in the lunchroom, some of them are done in people's offices, some of them are done in the boardroom. There are conversations going on all the time. The real question that I think is critical is, are those conversations productive and are they meaningful? And I think a lot of conversations revolve around tasks and activities that people are expected to do, which is perfectly understandable, and I wouldn't for a minute suggest that we don't talk about those things. But what happens is that there doesn't seem to be many other conversations that go on in the workplace, and they're the conversations, the developmental conversations, that I'm very interested in talking to you about today. So I think, probably taking that theme a bit further, I think it's fair to say that conversations or organisations are really a series of conversations. So I think one of the first things we should try and conceptualise an organisation is it's about people, and it's about people communicating with each other. And I think if we can come to that realisation, we're a long way towards thinking about this topic of creating a culture of conversation. So good quality conversation, I think, is sadly neglected, as I've mentioned, and I think that people are having conversations around tasks and they're delegating all sorts of activity, but are they really sitting down and talking to people about how they might get the best from them? Are they really encouraging people? Are they really talking about people's strengths? Are they talking about their opportunities for growth? Are they talking about the vision that that manager has for the section or the unit or whatever it is? Probably not. And there seems to be, sadly to say, a neglect of really positive conversations. And you know, please don't get me wrong, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but I'm not simply talking around, I'm not simply sitting saying let's down tools and just talk about our home life, or let's talk about what we did on the weekend. That is not what I'm really on about. It's really connecting with people and understanding that the key role of a leader in any organisation, I think, is actually about the development of the people. And it's pretty hard to develop people if you're not talking to them. And I guess that's the key point about this book and about this webinar. We hear this phrase a lot, don't we? The art of conversation. I think that this is a myth. I actually don't think there's too much art to it at all, because we are constantly having conversations every day. There's no great art. It's a pretty straightforward process, and I think sometimes we get all concerned that, you know, we need to sort of give people a skill set to have conversations. I don't deny for a minute that the difficult conversations do require a certain brand of skill. I have no doubt about that. But I'm not here in this webinar today to just talk about negative conversations. I'm here to talk about lots of conversations, positive conversations, developmental conversations. I don't really think there is an art form, and frankly, the best way to become good at having a conversation is actually practice, like most things. So you can go to a workshop and you can learn how to have a conversation with people. But at the end of the day, the real way of learning is actually doing. And, you know, it's really interesting, isn't it, that we're so removed from talking to people in this day and age. Can you imagine going to your parents, if they're still alive, and saying to them, guess what we're doing today? We're having a workshop on how to have a conversation. I think they would be quite amused. I mean, when you sit back and think about that, it is quite amusing. Notwithstanding, of course, that some conversations do require training, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that training's not important, but I find it fascinating that people will often say to me, oh, we're not really ready for having conversations. And I guess my retort is, well, when will you be ready? You know. So the art of conversation is a bit of a myth, I think. I think that look, I just posed the question. I wonder whether we have actually lost the need for conversations. Is it? I mean, if you're going home, if you're at work today and you're going home on public transport, so you're going home on a train or a bus, just stop for a minute and have a look around the people on the bus or the train. They'll all have their head buried in a screen of some sort. There'll be very little conversation, I would have thought. Those people will get home that night and turn on the television, so they look at another screen, and in between, in commercials, they might update their Facebook or whatever. So I just wonder whether we've completely lost sight of the need for conversations. It's just a thought that we both do talk about in the book. It's an interesting thought about whether that's true. A lot of managers say to me, oh, look, you know, I think conversations are wonderful, but I just don't have time for them. Of course, the assumption they're making, of course, is that conversations aren't productive, or at least are less productive than the other work that we do, and then people get buried in busyness. They'll attend mindless meetings, spend several hours on email, fill out reports that just get filed, and then, of course, they have no time to have those conversations. If you think about the good leaders in your workplaces, that's precisely what they do. They make time to have conversations because they understand the value of it and they understand how powerful they are. The only thing is we can't quantify it, and I think in our rational business world we kind of think that if we can't put a number on it, it probably doesn't matter. So I do hear that excuse a lot. Kuzner and Posner, who are real gurus in the whole area of leadership, and I'd highly recommend getting hold of their books. Kuzner and Posner make a statement that I like very much. And they basically say that leadership is a relationship. Leadership is a relationship. In other words, without any form of professional working relationship, it's pretty hard to lead somebody. And I think they're right. So my question really to you is, how do we form that relationship? And pretty obvious, isn't it? There's only one way, and that is through conversation. So the conversations are unavoidable if we're trying to develop trusting working relationships. And if we need trusting working relationships to influence people, then we've got no choice but to find the time to have these conversations that I'm talking about. So, there are a number of things there that I just throw out there for you to have a think about as we move through this webinar. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I think that workplace culture is the critical barrier or enabler for conversations. And what you can see on the screen here is a concept that's very well known, and many of you probably have heard of it. It's the psychological contract. Psychological meaning in your head, contract meaning between two or more parties. So what happens is that when people come to work on the left-hand side, that is the individual employee, they have certain expectations of what the workplace will offer them. And they have expectations of what they're willing to offer in exchange for those, for that transaction. In the same way, organisations through their managers expect certain things from employees, and they're willing to offer certain things in exchange for those expectations being met. And this is what we call a psychological contract. But what's happening is that the contract has changed significantly over the last 30-odd years, and a lot of us kind of know that, but we're not quite sure how to get a handle on it. The old contract was the them and us. I do the thinking, you do the doing, I'm the boss, you're the employee, get on with it. If you've got issues, come to me, but otherwise, get on with it. If you don't hear from me, you know that it's good news. That kind of mindset and mentality is still pretty prevalent in the world of work today. Even though we might not think it is, it is. That kind of mindset or psychological contract is not conducive to having conversations, as you could imagine. So if you're in a very formal organisation where there's a huge barrier between management and workforce, obviously no matter how much training you do or what you do, frankly, it's unlikely that you're going to create a culture of conversation. So the psychological contract is critical. So much so that I put together a model or a framework that might help you. And while I'm going through these values, you might like to actually think about where your organisation sits in terms of these values. So I've got old and new values. And when I say old values, I'm talking about values that were quite prevalent as short as 30 to 40 years ago, but are still evident today in the workplace. New values are the values that you need in order to create a culture of conversation. So let's have a look. There are 8 of these values. In the old workforce, it was all about specialisation, finding a niche and specialising. And, you know, that was pretty much it. You know, find something that where you could insulate yourself from the competition, from an employee perspective, and even from an organisational perspective, and you're doing yourself a favour and the public that you serve. But actually, things are moving so fast now, and specialisation is such a commodity. The new value really is flexible deployment. So how can I use the skills and attributes that I have in a variety of different contexts? So the environment changes quickly. I have a skill set that can be adapted and changed to that environment. Is the value that we actually need. So if you're an accountant, for example, you get a range of different projects to deal with where you've got to apply your skills in a range of different formats and so forth. So that's really a more realistic value, and obviously that lends itself to conversations around development and opportunity and context. So that's one value. So when I'm going through this, I have a think about where your organisation sits. Is it on the left-hand side? Is it on the right-hand side? Or is it in flux between the old and the new? Because that would be a very useful starting point to determine whether you're going to be able to create this culture of conversation. So the old value is internal focus, that is dotting I's and crossing T's internally. So if we have our quality systems in place, if we do things in a very routine, systematic way, the argument is we minimise the errors that come out the other end. And of course, you know, the best example of that around in the world is probably McDonald's, you know, that everything's done, everything's a paint by numbers approach, so that basically we can put anyone in the system and what we produce at the end is fairly predictable. Now, there's still a place for that, clearly, but really in this day and age, customers are so fickle, they have so many choices and so many options, and you know, they have higher standards of what they want, that really the new value is customer focus. And I don't mean customer service, I'm talking about everything that's said, done and thought about should have the end user in mind. Now, if we can create if we've genuinely got a culture like that, then it opens itself up to lots of conversations around dealing with scenarios, difficult situations, unique requests from customers, what we need to do in order to be able to service that need if and when another situation like that comes around. The third value is a focus on the job. So the good old job description, I've got a book coming out in November called The End of the Job Description, so you can imagine what I think about job descriptions. But, you know, we try to quarantine what people are supposed to do on a slip of paper and then have a disclaimer at the bottom saying any other duties deemed relevant by the manager, which is just making a mockery of the whole thing, which lends itself to Dilbert-style jokes. Yes, we do need a work document. Yes, we do need to describe what people do. Yes, we do need KPIs. But at the end of the day, the value we're really trying to instill is performance focus. And performance focus is about getting the job done as effectively as possible, not just a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. This is about actually getting results and adding value. So we're really interested in having conversations around performance and what people can do to lift their game, to build on their strengths and minimise their weaknesses. The next value is, functional-based work. I work in the marketing department, or I work in the sales department, or I work in the manufacturing department. So we have departments, and the departments never talk to each other. Really, the process now is project-based work. That really cross-functional communication becomes the key. And most things, if you think about them in your workplace, actually are cross-functional, despite the fact that their genesis might be in one department or end up in another. They are essentially cross-functional. And so really a new value is getting people to work in temporary and permanent cross-functional teams in order to get the job done. which lends itself to conversations around communication, teamwork, working with and through myriad of different situations and bosses. So project-based work is really the new value. Human dispirit and work. Now, I'm from the baby boomer generation, and when I started work, I just did what I was told. That was that. I just put my head down and my backside up, and I did whatever I was told. And some people might say that was very virtuous, but whether I enjoyed what I was doing or not was kind of a secondary consideration. In this day and age, and you see it a lot in younger people coming to the workplace, they want to do something meaningful with their work. And I think if that's harnessed correctly, it's a very healthy development. So the whole movement around meaningful work and engaging employees, getting employees to bring their heart and mind to work, that now becomes the critical success factor. So the new value is about providing people with some degree of meaning in their work. That requires having conversations. What are people's strengths? How can we utilize them more effectively in the work that you do? How can we minimize opportunities, minimize weaknesses? We have to have a conversation around that and not just get people to mindlessly follow directions, as I did when I first started out in the world of work. Loyalty now gives way to commitment. The average person now is spending less than 2 years in the workplace, in one workplace. That's getting shorter and shorter, and that's the reality we're facing. So the question then is, how do we get people to commit while they're here? It's not so much how long they're here for, but how committed are they while they're here? And that requires conversations around key performance indicators, projects, getting people engaged, giving people vision, encouraging people. Training. Training is, what I mean by training, of course, is sitting in a sort of a classroom and being, spoken to by someone who's an expert in an area with a set curriculum. There's still a place for all the things on the left-hand side. Please don't get me wrong, but we need to be moving across to the right-hand side. And in that sense, I think we need a broader interpretation of what we're talking about, which is actually learning and development. It's about coaching, it's about delegation, it's about mentoring. All of those things require conversations. So if we're only just committed to technical training, there really isn't too much need for any sort of conversations at all. Closed information. The old thinking was, if you don't hear from me, it's good news, or if you need to know, I'll tell you. Now, that doesn't work anymore. We actually want people to show initiative in the workplace. So if we want people to show initiative in the workplace, they need to have access to more information than they once did. So your workplace has got to have a culture of open information. Of course, there are some things that have to be kept from employees. I understand that. But at the end of the day, employees have got to understand what's going on. And that requires conversations, and that requires collaboration, it requires those sorts of, it requires communication. So have a think about whether your organisation is on the right, on the left, or is it in flux between the old and the new. I would have to say to you that that is the #1 barrier before I launch into 9 others. So you might want to have a think about your organisation before you start looking at the next 9. But let me go into the next 9. So the next 9 barriers, here they are. They're not necessarily in any order, and I wouldn't necessarily say that one is more important than the other. I've shared with you what I think is the biggest barrier, which is the psychological contract. But let's run through these and let's talk about each of these briefly. And again, you might like to think about your own organisation where you fit in. Inattentiveness during conversations. We've all been there, where the glazed look comes over people's eyes, and of course the other person doesn't think we know, but we do know. Concentrating on what someone's got to say is hard work. It takes commitment. it's not easy to do because we kind of anticipated what they're going to say, or we're waiting for them to shut up so we can say what we want to say. That's got to be a huge barrier, and it happens everywhere all the time. We're all guilty of it. We've all got to work hard at trying to be completely attentive in conversations. So that's a psychological barrier. Restricted information channels where we're only getting told information on a need-to-know basis. I've kind of covered that. So we've got to share. I think if you're a manager, and I know many of you are, if you are a manager, you really, and you're sitting there thinking, should I or shouldn't I tell my people about this? That's a surefire sign you should. In other words, if you're in doubt, share it. And if if you clearly think you shouldn't, well then don't. But if you're in doubt, share it. Lack of feedback. This is an issue right across the board that unfortunately managers just aren't giving feedback. They wait for the dreaded performance review and then it's too late. It happened 6 months ago. We need to develop a culture where people are giving feedback, good feedback, feedback to improve, maybe negative feedback, but we need to give people feedback. That's got to be a barrier. A culture of not asking questions, and really I'll sort of talk a little bit more about that later, but at the end of the day, most people that get into a managerial position have been promoted on the basis of their technical expertise. And most technical expertise comes from a capacity to answer questions, not to ask questions. So, that's what we learn, how to actually answer questions. So when you become a manager, you're actually in the business of asking questions, not answering them. But a lot of managers find that leap very difficult. Too much formality. The best conversations are actually in the corridor. The best conversations are informal. The most useful because people are relaxed, they're willing to open up. And I think sometimes conversations are too stilted and formal, so that's got to be a barrier to real communication. Another barrier is, and I've mentioned it earlier with my little my little story about the two engineers, is an over-reliance on email. Look, if you do nothing else and you haven't done it already, develop a protocol about email in your workplace and get some buy-in across the organisation. When it can be used, what it's used for, who should be copied in, and so forth and so on. And if you can reduce the amount of emails flying around by 10-15%, that could be better actually dealt with via conversation, then you're definitely ahead. If your senior managers are not having conversations, that will be a huge barrier. In other words, people are watching to see how the CEO and the people that report to him or her are actually talking to each other. And if they're not talking to each other, then what people see is what people will do. So the first place to start is with your senior team. The fear of emotion. One of the reasons that people don't have conversations is that they're fearful of opening a can of worms, and they don't want to talk about the elephant in the room. And they assume that by not talking about it will actually make it better. It won't. We all know that deep down. We actually have to talk about things. And if we don't talk about things, it actually gets worse because the tension builds, the mistrust increases, and it has all sorts of residual effects, as many of you who are HR managers in this webinar would testify to. And finally, office layout. There's probably nothing you can do about this in the short term, but the further away a person is seated from other people in the office, the less involved, studies show this, the less involved in conversations they'll be. So, it's just, have a think. If you're moving office, and there's a lot of planning that should go into that and to get it right, because the further, as I say, out of sight, out of mind, and that's pretty much how people operate. So there's 9 barriers you might like to think about, and think about your own workplace and where you fit in relation to that. Now, some of you have, and I'll I won't spend too much time on this because some of you would be aware of my 5 conversations framework, but it's just a framework to facilitate a process whereby managers are having regular, structured, informal conversations with their team. And you'll notice that on the left-hand side there are months 1 through 5. In the second column it's the topic of conversation. Then we have the content of each of those conversations, and then we have the key questions. The bottom line is the framework is set up so that it's expected that every manager or supervisor, anybody leading anybody, is expected to have 10 to 15 minute conversations with each of the people that report to them every year. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, we don't have time for that, or these conversations are structured around 10 to 15 minutes. So really, to try and take that excuse out of the equation, I've structured it around 10 to 15 minutes. There is only 1 or 2 questions, actually 2 or 3 questions for each conversation. So if they go longer than 15 minutes, it's because the manager and the person having the conversation has decided to do that. But there are a lot of organisations all over the world, as I mentioned, who have now embraced the 5 conversations framework as a substitute for the dreaded performance review. Other organisations are using it as an enabler to ensure that the performance review is a better process. So that you've had these 5 conversations leading up to a performance review, there's a reasonable chance that the performance review will be a more effective exercise. So I can certainly talk more with you offline about the 5 conversations framework. I'm happy to do that. But it's just one framework. There are many frameworks out there that can be used. Now, there are 5 everyday conversations apart from the 5 conversations that people should be having with their team. Let me go through those. Obviously, a coaching conversation is very useful, and coaching really should be a conversation. It's not a one-way monologue where a technical expert is dumping all this technical information on a particular employee. It actually should be a 2-way dialogue. So coaching, I would argue, is a conversation that we're expecting to see people have. The higher up a person is in the organisation, the more likely the coaching is to be around people management and dealing with situations and people. And the lower down in the organisation, if I could use that phrase, the more likely the conversation will be around technical know-how. Irrespective of where a manager is, they should be having regular coaching conversations. I'd also suggest that one of the ways to facilitate meaningful conversations in your workplace is to implement a mentoring program. And now, be warned, if you're too structured here, it won't work. So if everybody's got to be mentored and everybody's got to be involved and every month that won't work. Mentoring works when trust is built between 2 people, and trust is something you can't really do, you can't structure something around, but there's no reason why you shouldn't start a mentoring program. And you know, if you've got an organisation of hundreds of people and you get a mentoring program with 10 mentees and 10 mentors in the first year, I will guarantee to you there'll be 2 success stories out of that. And there'll probably be also two situations that really didn't get off the ground, and probably 6 sessions, 6 mentoring partnerships that were pretty okay but didn't set the world on fire. You're better off with that sort of scenario than not having anything. So mentoring is certainly a great conversation. Delegation is actually a conversation as well. Again, this is not about barking orders at somebody and giving instructions. It's about working with and through other people in order to get the job. It's actually about development. It's actually about developing other people. And if we can instill this concept into managers, then it's likely that delegation will become a conversation rather than just a mechanical offloading of work to another person. Visioning is a conversation that I find is hugely absent in the workplace. Managers should be sharing the vision. Now, what I mean by that is I don't mean the vision statement on the wall. The manager should be constantly talking about the big picture. You know, why are we doing what we're doing? And the work that you're doing, how does that actually link in with what we're trying to achieve in this team or this department or this division or this organisation? We don't do enough of this. A colleague of mine in the United States wrote a book several years ago called Fake Work, which is a great title. And his argument was that 40% of everything that's done in organisations is fake. In other words, it's wasting time. It's going to mindless meetings, it's attending to meaningless emails and so forth and so on. His argument is, imagine if you could reduce that from 40% to 35%, what a difference it would make. One of the ways of doing that is to keep people on task. On task is actually visioning. So it's not Pollyanna, pie in the sky, Martin Luther type rhetoric. It's really ensuring that people understand the why. And of course, people need encouragement. So I don't see enough of this either. People need to feel that their manager is interested in their welfare, is interested in their development, and is encouraging. So encouraging conversations good leaders will have regularly. So there are 5 conversations additional in the book, and there's more information obviously in the book about each of those conversations. Okay, moving right along. The face of good communication. The eyes represent assessing non-verbal communication. The ears represent what we actually hear, both what the words that we hear and perhaps what we don't hear. The upside down question mark, which is used in the Spanish language, represents the questions that we ask. As I said earlier on, good conversations are about good questions. And of course the mouth is what we say and how we say it. And Aubrey and I use this model in our book to really tease out some of the very important micro skills around good conversations, and there'll be more in the book about that. So just a couple of things before we finish up. One of the interesting, I think, perspectives that we take in the book is that we believe that if you look at this chart here, you've got 3 positions that people can be in when they're in a conversation. Let's take the first position in the bottom left-hand corner. First position is when you're just thinking about yourself. And human beings would be in first position, I would imagine, something in the order of 70-odd% of the time. That's just the nature of human existence. You know, we're often thinking about ourselves and how we'll respond and, you know, what we'll do. That's just normal human behaviour. But if you're in first position when you're having a conversation with somebody else who happens to have a different point of view, then it's likely that that position is going to stop you listening and understanding their perspective. So second position is where you stop for a moment and actually try to put yourself into the shoes of the other person. Now, I don't mean completely in the shoes, it's impossible, but at least try to understand where the other person's coming from. Now, the only way to do that, of course, is through questions. If you don't actually stop and say, just so I understand where you're coming from, can you explain your position to me, please? And then listening without interrupting, attentively, and trying to at least understand. Doesn't mean you have to agree, it just means you need to get yourself to that position. Even more superior position for anyone in any leadership role is third position. That is where we're actually, not only do we understand our position and we appreciate the position of the other party, but we're also able to see the bigger picture. So we can put the conversation in context. I use the analogy of it's a little bit like being in a helicopter hovering over a forest. You can't see the individual trees, but you obviously know there's a forest because there's a sea of green below you. But if you're in the forest and you've got your head buried up against a branch of a tree, or the trunk of a tree, I should say, clearly you're in first position. You really don't know that you're in a forest because your only vision is the trunk that's in front of you. So the key for people in conversations is actually to get themselves in third position. And if you see two people having an argument, for example, then that's a classic example of two people who are adopting first position. In other words, they're defending their own turf, they're defending their own beliefs, their own ideas, and they're refusing to listen to the other person, and often turns into a shouting match or even physical violence. So that's one of the things we share in the book. I won't spend much time on this because we're getting short of time, but another thing that we talk about is very much good conversations is about asking good questions. And as I said before, most people who are in a leadership role have been promoted there because they're good at answering questions, and all of a sudden they're now expected to ask questions. That becomes difficult. But the questions that we ask are the questions are around open questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. If we can get people to ask those questions, then it opens up a genuine conversation of two people in a dialogue. So, why did you say that? I'm interested to know. Or when did that take place? Or how do you mean? And so forth and so on. So I believe, out of all the things that we go through in our book, that the two critical skills are questioning skills and the capacity to put ourselves into second and third position. So just to give you a taste of what's in the book. All right, now the other thing I'd like to say, just to give a quick plug, is that we have a one-day workshop which we've put together for organisations that are interested in exploring conversations. And we put what you can, I won't run through it laboriously, and if you're interested, I'm more than happy to send you some more information with costs and so forth. So if there is of interest and you really do need to do some training on conversations, here is an opportunity. We enclose the book as part of the package, and we also, there's a comprehensive workbook that goes with that as well. But you can see that some of the bullet points there are things that we've covered today, but obviously in much more detail. So let me know if you're interested. I'm more than happy to talk with you about that. So we're just about ready for questions, and just before I launch into that, a couple of things, well, one thing I'd really like to say is I would be, my book has just come out yesterday actually. I just came back from overseas. I'm back in Brisbane, Australia today, and I'm chuffed to say the book is out. So Conversations at Work is now out, and it is available at Amazon or any good bookstore, as they say. But if you would like to order it through me, I'd be more than happy to give you a 20% discount. It says RE there, but you don't need to be a member of RE. If you send me an email by this afternoon, today, if you send me an email today and just request the discount, I will send that to you. I'll sign it for you and I'll send it out in the mail. So there's an offer you might like to take advantage of. All right, so let's launch into some questions. We've got a few minutes left, so let's launch into some questions. Somebody's asking here, hi, how do we ask questions? Look, all you have to do is just go to the right-hand side, and in the question panel there's a drop-down bar, and if you type in your question, I will see it. So go ahead and do that. Someone's asking, can you please send some information on the workshop? More than happy to do that, Heidi. I will do that. There's a question around the barriers of the conversations. And somebody's asking me here, if your workplace has the old psychological contract, where is the best place to start in terms of changing the culture? Well, it's a good question. Look, I think the answer to that question, frankly, is anywhere, but start. Don't just accept it as it is. It is interesting that it depends on how, how fixed the organisation is on the old values. If those old values are very, very obvious, then you really need to start working on those values. And look, the place to start, in my view, is with your management team. I think, if you're looking for the best return on investment, I think if you don't get your leadership right, you're in trouble. So it is very, very important to make sure that your managers are completely on board with what we're trying to do, and that's where I concentrate all my efforts, because once you get them on board, it should cascade throughout the organisation. Well, I hope it does at least, but that's where I would start. Okay, so start with your managers. That's the answer to that one. Got another question here. How does the 5 conversations framework go about with performance appraisals also part of the organisation? Well, as I said earlier, if you adopted the 5 conversations, and by adopting it, there's an online support system with it as well, which I'm more than happy to show you offline, which basically gives a process where people can record their comments. There's an action planning pull-down bar. There's a whole lot of really useful tools there that you can use for the 5 conversations framework. So where does it relate? That's your question. Your question is really much, where does it relate to the traditional performance review? It might be too much of a leap to get rid of your performance review. Now, I understand some organisations are very traditional. It might be just a huge ask to say, let's get rid of it and replace it with 5 conversations. If that's the case, then what I suggest you do is you might think about implementing the 5 conversations as a culture change initiative, and also as an opportunity to enable a better performance review outcome. Because if you can get a manager and an employee to have 5 brief, meaningful, casual, open conversations before the appraisal time, I'm pretty confident the appraisal will go better. So in other words, the answer to your question is, you can use it as an enabler to create a better performance review. But if some organisations don't have performance reviews, and they just leap straight into the 5 conversations and try to create a conversation culture. Other organisations can't get rid of it, so they use this as an enabler. You just have to look at your own organisation, and you just have to determine, well, what's in the best interest, what can we do, and what should we try to do. The other thing that you might like to try is a pilot program. If it's a large organisation, just jump in and do a pilot. Just take a section of the organisation, and then after you get some runs on the board, you might be able to say to the rest of the organisation, well, this is working, let's implement it across the organisation. And I'm happy to, give a presentation internally if that might help you to sell that process, if that's what you're trying to do. Okay, other questions that we've got. Here's another one. Okay, one question here, but managers may not have answers around all the questions. That's true, managers may not have all the answers, and that's actually a good thing. I actually think that one of the signs of a good leader is somebody that's humble, that's somebody who's basically human. We don't have all the answers, and we shouldn't try and pretend we do. And sometimes the very best response to people is to actually say, I don't know the answer to that, let's discuss it. Or, I don't know the answer to that, but let's investigate it. or I don't know the answer to that, but I'm more than willing to look into it for you. I actually think there's more sincerity and genuineness in that kind of response than to muddle through and try and pretend that you know, because the other person knows. You know, we're not foolish in these things. So I think a sense of humility is a wonderful attribute for a leader, and it actually goes a long way. So look, the answer to the question that you're asking is I don't think managers have to have all the answers. The very fact that something is being discussed is a good thing. And sometimes people can agree to disagree. I actually think that's a very good thing. So just to say to the other person, look, let's just agree to disagree. I don't have an answer. I have a view, you have a view. Let's just park it and let's move on. That's actually quite useful. Obviously, if it's a very important issue, you can't do that, but a lot of things you can. And I think a manager just has to take the lead on that. So I think conversations help in that regard. So I think the person that asking me this question is talking especially around career, which is a challenge in a flat organisation. It is a challenge in a flat organisation. When you're talking about careers, look, you know, I think that, you know, in this day and age, the manager shouldn't be holding the employee's hand with careers. The employee should be sorting out their own career. That's the way the world is at the moment and has been for several decades. I think what we've got to do as a manager is to be able to listen and guide and inform where it's applicable. We're not there to give them answers, perhaps just to listen and to be a sounding board, if in fact that's going to be useful. But you're right, the reality is the ladder is a lot shorter, that is the corporate ladder. It's a lot shorter than it once was. It's up against a shaky wall. In other words, it can change very quickly. And that's the reality. That's the world we're living in. But that's, so really it's about skill acquisition. It's about developing flexible in deployment. As I said earlier, that's one of the values. It's about, learning new skills and so forth. It's about building on people's strengths and capabilities. That's the conversation we should be having with people. We don't have to have answers around every single question that people ask, but rather just to have the conversation. Sometimes the answer is the conversation. Sometimes we don't need to have an answer. The very fact that we've talked about it may well bear fruit, even though it doesn't seem logical. Not everything requires a rational answer or response. I think, I might just end there. We don't seem to have any other questions, but thank you for those. But if there are questions, you've got my email address. Send them to me, and I'm more than happy, and I will respond to them. But I just leave you with the thought, really, that organisations are really collections of human beings who have decided to come together to achieve a common purpose. And because they are a collection of human beings, their conversation is a vehicle by which we can get the most from human beings, or we can get more from human beings. And I think, unfortunately, what's happening in our technological age is that we're using technology when we actually should be having those conversations. So, food for thought. Thank you very much for your involvement today. I hope you found it useful. Happy to talk offline to anyone about the book or the workshop. So happy to talk with you about that. But thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you again at another one of my webinars. Thank you.